Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. And this week's special guest is somebody fascinating to discuss ideas with because she's Geeta Gopinath, Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund, who also will soon be the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Thank you very much, Dr. Gopinath, and great to have you on the Dialogues.
I'm happy to join you, Sonia.
Well, it's an interesting time to interview you because, of course, we're going now headlong, it seems, into another COVID crisis with both the United Kingdom and the United States sounding the alarm on the Omicron variant. How is the IMF, or how would you be looking at this impact in 2022?
Yes, Sonia, unfortunately, we've been living in interesting times for a bit too long, and we are very closely following what the developments on the Omicron front because we do our January World Economic Outlook update, and we have to decide whether we need to change our baseline or we think of this as a big downside risk. The short answer is we haven't settled on that yet. What we know is that cases are going up rapidly, that it seems to be, at least the preliminary evidence is that it's much more infectious than Delta. And now it could be less severe than Delta, but if the numbers are that big in terms of people being infected, then that could just overwhelm the hospital system, even if a smaller fraction of people end up in hospital. And we're already seeing, of course, a reaction in terms of restrictions on travel and mobility and so on, which obviously has implications for the world. But how severe all of this is going to be, we are still making a determination at this point.
So you don't have a ballpark estimate on the impact, you think?
No.
In fact, interestingly, many of the lessons you would have thought that the globe would have learned that perhaps shouldn't be done, for instance, shutting down travel for certain countries, trying to contain it within borders, vaccine inequities are still very much a reality as we go into perhaps a phase 2 of this pandemic. As looking at it from the IMF perspective, what do you think the globe perhaps need to do now right and stop doing wrong?
Vaccine inequity is tragic. And the fact that we're at the end of 2021 with high-income countries having 70% of the population vaccinated and less than 4% of the population in low-income countries vaccinated is just a tragedy. The targets were set to vaccinate 40% of the population in every country by the end of this year. There are about 80 countries that are not going to meet that mark. And for the vast majority of them, it's because they just don't have enough vaccine supply. For instance, on COVAX, the contracts it has with companies, only about 18% of its contracted doses have been delivered. So they've not been prioritized in the deliveries. That needs to change. The donations that were pledged need to be delivered. About 1.5 billion doses have been pledged. About 300 million have been delivered so far. And countries need to be helped to be prepared so when the shots come, they can go in arm.
Right.
And that has to all, it has to take place on a Herculean front. Now, of course, what we're seeing now is the big demand for boosters that have gone up, especially with the Omicron variant. So I am worried that we might again have a problem with getting enough supplies to low-income countries with the fact that now there will be even more of a desire to hoard vaccines at home.
And you've, of course, been talking on inflationary pressures and the impact on monetary policy for whether it's developed countries or emerging markets. You just met the Prime Minister as well this week. As an emerging market economy, what do you think India needs to be looking at in terms of monetary policy given the inflationary pressures? We've just had a wholesale price inflation at a record since 1991, retail inflation rising as well. What would your recommendations be?
Globally, what we are seeing is that there are some common factors in inflation. So when you look at energy prices and you look at food prices, they were elevated, and both of them have fed into higher levels of headline inflation in many countries. Then you have had the supply chain disruptions, the supply bottlenecks, the semiconductor shortages, especially for the auto industry, which has affected all countries, including India, the auto sector in India. And imported, input costs, intermediate input costs have gone up, showing up again in wholesale prices in many countries in the world. So I think these are challenging times because for many emerging and developing countries, including India, while there has been a recovery, it's not complete. There is much more distance that needs to be traveled. And at the same time, you're seeing inflationary pressures. In India, it's still close to the upper band. It's about, core inflation is at about 6.1%, but it's sticky at that level. And so that's something you need to keep a very close eye on. And then third, the US Fed is moving towards, much quicker normalization, very likely increase in interest rates next year, multiple rounds. So that should also then tighten global financial conditions. So from an emerging market perspective, you're going to have to manage these three pieces, which is support the recovery, be vigilant on inflation, and make sure that the financial house is in order as financial conditions tighten. For India, we think it remains appropriate to keep monetary policy somewhat accommodative in the near term. But if inflation starts going up, and especially inflation expectations show signs of serious de-anchoring, then it's important to move more aggressively on monetary policy front.
How did the meeting with the Prime Minister go? It's interesting, of course, so this is a government which has really pushed through many reforms in these last 2 years, lockdown years as it were, but had to turn its back on farm laws and the reforms there because of domestic opposition. That's always an interesting balance. And how was the meeting with the Prime Minister?
It was an excellent meeting with the Prime Minister. There is a lot to worry about in the world right now with the pandemic, with what's happening with inflation, with climate financing, climate challenges, which is another big issue that is also a big risk on the plate right now. And also looking ahead, India is going to have the G20 presidency in 2023, which would make India very prominent on the world stage in terms of handling the G20. So we touched on all these different issues.
Not on reforms and getting them through?
No, we also talked about the multiple kinds of reforms that have been undertaken in India, and a lot has been done. I think this is definitely was a crisis that was used to kind of push through a lot of reforms. But again, as we all know, there is more recovery that's needed, and also the recovery has come through, but there is unevenness in the recovery. If you look at labor markets, haven't healed yet. If you look at MSMEs, they still need, the recoveries are still weaker. So, but this is a challenge countries are facing everywhere.
No, and of course, and as you know well, of course, having from India and having studied in India, that poverty is always a huge issue here, and India had great success in lifting a large number, millions out of the poverty line index, and now worries about people slipping back and job losses. Is that something which is the focus for the IMF, especially in countries like India?
That is an unfortunate effect of this pandemic, which is the gains that were made in poverty reduction. Some of that was reversed last year in terms of at least people's access to incomes and jobs. In many countries, lots of support was provided in terms of cash transfers. Even in India, cash transfers in food grains, so that helped. But what we are worried about is that if the pandemic keeps going on, like the way it has in the last 2 years, then most governments don't have the fiscal space to continue to provide large amounts of support. So I think it's going to become more challenging. It has to be much more targeted, and use your limited resources to make sure that it goes to the most vulnerable in the population. And given the global like I said, because interest rates are going to go up in the U.S. and in other advanced economies, it's important also to have very good medium-term fiscal consolidation plans. So it's very clear that the economy is on a good trajectory on a fiscal basis. Reserves, having a large amount of reserves, which India does have, also helps. So you're going to have to manage these trade-offs. But it is the fact that poorer households, more vulnerable households have been deeply affected is a big concern.
As I said, it's an interesting time also to interview you when you were heading back to Harvard, and now you're staying on at the IMF with that huge new promotion. In fact, it's wonderful that the 2 top positions at the IMF will be held by women economists. Now, that's a huge change, because often you must have been the only woman economist in a room, you and your counterparts. That's changing. What was it like for you? Has it been a challenging journey to reach here?
It's been challenging, yes. It's been exhilarating in some sense too. I am a workaholic, so I don't complain about being awake at all hours. And the last 2 years have been intense. Originally I thought I would be going back to Harvard and resume my academic life, which would be at a slower pace. But just given where the world is and given all the stresses that are still there, I just thought I should stay on in public service for some time longer. And, it's going to be, these are going to be very challenging times for sure, on multiple fronts.
Is it interesting to be called a trailblazer, role model for young women, especially Indian young women? Because you've had the trajectory of course, studying in Mysuru, then LSR and these schools. So a huge inspiration for so many young Indian women out there. What would you tell them?
Well, first of all, I'm very kind that somebody says that. I'm always, whenever I hear it, I'm like, wow, that's very nice of people to say that. But it is true. I grew up in Mysore. I went to Nirmala Convent in Mahajana's college and took my first class in economics in Lady Shri Ram College. So, I hope my story is something that says that you could come from pretty ordinary backgrounds, and if you set your mind to accomplishing things, that it can happen.
I read a lovely interview of your parents where your father, like all Indian parents, said you were a pretty average student till you were in junior school, and your mother said you still make time to call her every day. So in that sense, it's a nice time also for us to be, as Indian journalists, to see so many Indian origin CEOs shattering many ceilings, tech companies, the Chanel CEO, and of course IMF chief economist as well. What do you think is driving Indians to do so well in these global positions right now?
Well, I think there are lots of talented Indians around the world, and we are large in numbers, so we also will show up at a global stage. But I think we're all extremely thankful for, at least I can speak for myself, I'm extremely thankful for the education I had in India, the fact that your parents put a huge priority on it, my parents put a huge priority on my education, and just dreaming for the best possible. So. I think.
No, and I think it's wonderful in that sense when we talk about global openness, that there's opportunities also available to immigrants in other countries, and it's just merit based. I think that's a huge impact as well. And also just the point when we look at global and this bit about closing of borders and restrictions, is the IMF going to come up with some kind of recommendations perhaps on more openness when we're looking at economic impact of what shutting down borders often has?
Right. So, of course, decisions of shutting down borders are tied to health-related issues, and we leave that to the WHO to comment on. But our view has been that when it comes to global trade, that it is important to, not put restrictions on vaccine exports or exports of, medical equipment and so on. Trade has actually held up very well. So now we are seeing the supply chain disruptions and so on. But that's partly a reflection of the fact that demand for goods has grown very strongly at a time when people cannot spend on services, where they're not traveling, where they're not, going to large stadiums and attending events like that. So people are purchasing a lot of things online, and so there's a huge demand that's being placed on the World Trade Network, and that is leading to disruptions. But I think, it's been a big source of strength for the economy in terms of, having an integrated global system, which is something we always push for.
For India, somehow our benchmark, our competition is always looking at how can we occupy space which China perhaps has. And we looked at India, of course, the IMF, and at a function in LSR, the then IMF chief had described India as the bright spot in a globally challenging economies in the world. Do you still see India at that position, or where do you see India now?
For many countries, these are difficult years. Being hit by a pandemic and the recovery that comes after that, these are incredibly challenging times. We are seeing recoveries. In the case of India, I do think that the potential remains in terms of a large, young labor force. Of course, there are challenges that are still there in terms of making sure that they have the right skills and therefore can get the right kind of employment. The large English-speaking population. All of these are, have been traditionally touted as the strengths for India, which remain. There have been new reforms that have been going on, are also encouraging. The privatization of Air India, I think, has been a very good step in that direction. So there are reforms happening, but we have to keep in mind that even before the pandemic, there was slowing growth in India, and so the question is to ensure that coming out of the pandemic, there's robust enough growth in India. I don't think that can be taken for granted. But it is one of the absolute engines of growth in the world.
I mean, one of the axioms in India has always been that good economics is bad politics. Do you think that's going to play out as well when, I mean, we've got elections coming up, so do you think that you're going to see a slowdown, or what would you, how does reforms make good politics?
Well, I mean, firstly, I don't think it's necessarily that good economics is bad politics. So, for instance, in this pandemic, it was very important to make sure that you were supporting people and firms in terms of their cash transfers, providing support to small enterprises, loans, and so on. All of that was both good economics and I guess politically good too.
The free food
making sure
scheme, yes.
Free food, the health spending in the health sector. More will be needed on that front, on spending on health and spending on education, even especially in India also. So that will be needed. So that's not an issue. We have studied, though, the problems that come with trying to do reforms that are much more trickier, like labor market reforms. And it's certainly the case that those are much harder to do at a time when the economy has not fully recovered. And it's easier to do when there is strength and you have a booming economy. So timing is definitely important in terms of when you roll out certain reforms.
How worried are you about the impact of online education, especially in India where the digital divide is so stark in the access that children have to devices to access remote education? Do you think we're going to see a huge impact on that, especially in India?
I'm very worried about that. I saw some recent studies from ASAR, the evaluations that were done in terms of reading capabilities and math capabilities, and that has taken a hit. So, 2 years of children not having proper access to education is very costly. And these are the future labor force, for the future human capital for the country. So I think there's absolutely action needs to be taken to make sure that this is remedied. I am quite worried about it.
Geeta Gopinath, if you had three things to say, you met the Prime Minister already, but you had three things to tell the Indian government right now on how to get on track now with another COVID potential crisis booming. Luckily, our cases are down right now, but who knows, what would they be?
Well, I think first, which again is true for all countries, is to make sure that you are doing your vaccinations on a war footing. India is at about, in terms of the share of the total population, it's about 37% of the population that's fully vaccinated. Of course, that number in terms of first dose is much higher, closer to 60%. But what we see around the world is that when vaccine cases come down, pressure comes off, people, don't think about getting vaccinated. So getting over vaccine hesitancy and just on a war footing, pushing through much higher rates of vaccination, I think is essential. It's not going to solve you're still going to get infections. You're seeing that in the UK even with higher levels of vaccination rates. But everything points to the fact that even with Omicron, if you are vaccinated, you get some protection against severe disease and death. And that's what we should be targeting. So I think that's one big area. The second area is recovery. Like we said, there has been recovery. We've seen it after Delta. There's been a rebound after the reopening. But it's not done. It's not complete. There's still a big gap between where India would have been in the absence of the pandemic and where it is. So there is still need to keep in the near term fiscal and monetary policy accommodative. But at the same time, you communicate how you are going to consolidate over the medium term. So kind of very clearly, how would you bring the fiscal house in order over the medium term? Similarly, for monetary policy side, keeping a very close eye on inflation. I guess we talk so much of the health crisis, infection and inflation get mixed up now. So, and then the last thing is there are lots of long-standing issues that have to continue to be addressed, making sure there's sufficient spending on health, on education. India's done very well in terms of investment in physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, but there is much more that's needed. And of course on climate change. Big announcements have been made. But that will require very ambitious policies to attain those targets.
Well, we all know you as a world-famous economist, but what would you be doing if you weren't one?
I wish I had time to think about that question. But I guess I've been interested in reading up on data science and on artificial intelligence and so on. So, I would know nothing about it now, but if I had the time and if I wasn't doing economics, I guess I would spend some time on those areas.
Okay, fascinating. And how did you get interested in economics? Because as your dad put it, that you were just an average student, and how did you decide to go into
Yeah, you know,
economics?
I've been debating my father and asking exactly, because I see these reports that said that I got 47% in 7th standard. And it's funny because my classmates call me and say, when did you get 47%? We're trying to pin down exactly
He's being a desi parent.
where those numbers came from. But anyway, I did science all through my schooling. Mm-hmm. And then the expectation was that I would maybe become an IAS officer, very specific. And of course, nobody asked me my views on that. And then somebody said, well, economics is a good subject to do if you want to be in the IAS. And so I took my first class in LSR in economics. I had no idea what economics was before that. Mm-hmm. So that's why I refer to myself as an accidental economist.
Mm-hmm. You're, of course, in Washington now, but what do you remember about your Delhi days at LSR and then D school?
Those were, in LSR, I was in the hostel, which is a fantastic experience to be. I think being in an all-girls college has its benefits because you get into everything, when you put up a play, you're in charge of stage production and everything. There's no demarcation of here's what girls do and here's what boys do. So that was great. And of course, LSR was and remains the premier education institution in the country. Delhi School of Economics was fantastic too. And, for the first time, there were people from all these different parts of India doing their masters in economics. Great professors. Very fond memories of both those institutions.
And of course, since then, you've been a Harvard professor and now at the IMF. Which do you prefer, Harvard versus IMF? It's a great choice.
Both are fantastic. I've enjoyed both tremendously, it's more of timing, which is right now it seemed, given where the world was, that I might be of better service if I continue with the IMF than if I go back to my academic life. So that's why I'm staying at the IMF for now.
I read that the one thing you liked about Harvard is that you could wear jeans to classes, and at the IMF you all have to make sure that it's a very different image. So what's the Geeta Gopinath who's off duty like? Or are you the person?
What was the great thing about the COVID times was that you actually could wear jeans all the time because the only thing people could see was above your waist, and so that was actually it was fun to be casually dressed. I am actually somebody who likes quiet time in the sense that
you want to stay away from the
yes,
limelight.
exactly. But I can see that it contradicts the jobs I've taken, which has a lot of public presence. But I need to have periods where I just turn away and I go into a corner and I'm thinking a little deeply on certain issues. Mm-hmm. So, but now of course I find myself a lot in the public domain, which is
of course. You met so many different world leaders. Anything interesting that struck you about which are the ones that stand out for you? You, of course, just met Prime Minister Modi, but with all the world leaders you've met and interacted with.
Well, there are lots of important people in important positions. The ones I find most attractive are the ones who, use their seat at the table to help people around the world. You can always do a job. You can do any job, including the job I have, by just checking the boxes and making sure the trains run on time. Mm-hmm. I think what's important is when you have a seat at the table that you use it to kind of bring about change and get the right things done.
Mm-hmm. You've had so many firsts in your career. Which is the first that was most special?
Well, I think I don't know if this was the first or not, but I think one of the hardest things I had was getting tenure at Harvard was probably the toughest challenge I've faced in my life, and that was special.
Wonderful. Well, sometimes India is so often defined by Bollywood or cricket. Do you ever watch? Do you watch Bollywood movies?
Oh, good Lord, more than you can imagine.
Really?
Yes.
Which is your favorite?
No, don't ask me what my favorite. But actually, recently I've been watching mostly the shows that are there on Netflix and Amazon, and for instance, Patal Lok and Mirzapur and all of those kinds of.
So you're getting the gritty.
Yes. I love the shows that go into the small towns of India, the real the real lives, and so that's yes. There are lots of very good actors. I would watch anything Nawazuddin Siddiqui, for instance, is listed on. But there's very interesting not just movies, but also shows that are there now with a much more wider set of talent than used to be the case back in like the 80s and 90s.
No, absolutely. But still, it must have been a fantastic moment. Amitabh Bachchan, who at least I grew up on, was actually on KBC, had those really nice words to say about you.
No, that was, yes, that was very nice. I mean, what was particularly nice was that, to have Amitabh Bachchan in his baritone voice talk about who I was in terms of what I had accomplished in my schooling and so on. That for me was deeply, was somewhat moving. Yeah.
And finally, how does this has been such challenging times for everyone, and I'm sure at the IMF as well. What's your biggest stress buster?
Watching Bollywood movies and the shows.
Paatal Lok, yes.
No, that can be a stress buster too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Geeta Gopinath, it's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.